Most people assume child marriage in the ancient world was about lust, or about men wanting control over young bodies. The actual historical record points somewhere far less dramatic and far more disturbing in its own way. Spreadsheets, land, inheritance law, death rates. Marriage age, for most of history, was a math problem before it was anything else. For most of human history, a wedding wasn't primarily a romantic milestone, or even in the modern sense, primarily about the two people being married at all. It was a legal and economic transaction between two households, timed against a set of brutal, measurable realities: mortality, property, labor, and lineage, that most people alive today never have to calculate. Understanding why marriage age sat so low for so long, across so many unrelated legal systems, means setting aside the assumption that it was driven by a single motive and instead tracing the actual machinery: the laws that set the number, the death rates that pressured the timing, the property systems that made a daughter's marriage function as a financial event, and the inheritance rules that made her marriage date, in a very literal legal sense, more urgent than her brother's. It's worth being precise from the outset about what kind of claim this video is actually making, because the topic invites an easy but inaccurate shortcut. This is not an argument that early marriage was harmless, nor an argument that every documented case involved careful legal calculation rather than exploitation. It is a claim about mechanism, that the legal, demographic, and economic record, read directly from primary sources rather than assumption, shows a considerably more structured and, in specific documented respects, more internally cautious system than the bare number 12 suggests on its own. And that tracing exactly how that system worked, and exactly where and why its own internal safeguards failed, produces a far more useful picture than either romanticizing the past or reducing it to a single motive ever could. This video traces that machinery across 4 separate legal and economic systems: Roman law, medieval European canon law, English common law, and comparative dowry economics documented across multiple continents, before turning to the one detail nearly every one of those systems quietly built into its own rules: a recognized and in some places legally mandated gap between the age of legal marriage and the age of actual cohabitation. That gap is where this video's real turn sits, and it's also where historically the worst outcomes concentrated whenever poverty, war, or a specific ruling regime caused that gap to collapse. This video draws on legal history, demographic history, and economic anthropology spanning roughly 2,000 years of documentation, from Roman legal codes compiled in the 6th century to 21st century global demographic monitoring. None of what follows should be read as an attempt to excuse or minimize the practice of marrying children. The goal here is closer to something a legal historian or demographer would actually be after: identifying the specific, traceable mechanisms, legal, economic, and demographic, that produced this pattern across so many unrelated societies. Because understanding those mechanisms is also what makes it possible to understand exactly where historically protective legal machinery existed, and exactly where and why it failed. Begin with the number itself, because it shows up with startling consistency across legal systems that had no contact with each other, separated by centuries and by entire legal traditions. Roman law, codified across the Republic and later systematized under Justinian's compilation, completed in the Corpus Juris Civilis around 529 to 534 CE in Constantinople, set the minimum legal age for a girl's marriage at 12 and for a boy at 14. Legal historian Judith Grubbs, whose research on Roman family law has been published extensively, including her 2002 study Women in the Law in the Roman Empire, has documented that this wasn't a casual or rarely enforced threshold. It was treated as a genuine legal minimum, tied to a Roman legal concept of capacity, the age at which a person was considered capable of entering a valid marriage contract at all. Grubbs' research is specific on a point worth flagging immediately. Roman legal sources themselves distinguished between the minimum age of legal marriage and actual marital cohabitation, with substantial evidence drawn from funerary inscriptions, legal commentary, and marriage contracts, suggesting that actual first cohabitation for most Roman brides tended to occur measurably later than the bare legal minimum, often in the late teens. Grubbs' research draws specifically on a body of surviving Roman funerary inscriptions, epitaphs, that frequently recorded both a woman's age at death and, in a meaningful subset of cases, the length of her marriage, allowing historians to reconstruct approximate marriage age directly from the epigraphic record, rather than from legal text alone. That inscriptional evidence cross-referenced against Roman legal commentary on marriage capacity, written by jurists including Ulpian, whose opinions were later incorporated directly into Justinian's compilation, produced a picture Grubbs describes as consistently showing a gap between the bare legal floor of 12 and the age most brides, particularly among the better documented senatorial and equestrian classes, actually appear to have first cohabited. Grubbs' research also notes an important class distinction worth naming directly. The epigraphic evidence skews toward wealthier, better documented Roman families, and separate legal and literary evidence, including Roman legal complaints about excessively early marriages that do survive in the historical record, suggests the gap between legal minimum and actual cohabitation was not uniformly maintained across every level of Roman society. A pattern that will recur throughout this video's later chapters on where protective gaps most reliably failed. That detail matters enormously for what follows in this video, so it's worth naming directly at the outset. The number written into a legal code and the age at which a marriage actually functioned as a cohabiting household were not, even in Rome, automatically the same thing. Move forward roughly 1,000 years into medieval European canon law, and the same number reappears, now backed by an entirely different legal and theological tradition. Legal historian James Brundage, whose 1987 book Law, Sex, and Christian Society in Medieval Europe remains one of the foundational texts on medieval marriage law, documented that canon law, developed and systematized primarily through the 12th and 13th centuries under legal scholars working in centers including Bologna, set the minimum age of consent for marriage at 12 for girls and 14 for boys, a figure that persisted essentially unchanged across most of Catholic Europe for centuries. Brundage's research identifies the specific legal mechanism behind this number. Canon law required what was called consent, a verbal exchange establishing the marriage contract itself, called marriage de praesenti. And church courts held that a child below the age of reason, generally understood as around 7, couldn't meaningfully consent to anything, while a child between roughly 7 and 12 occupied a legal gray zone in which a betrothal could be formed, but not a binding consummated marriage. So what's actually driving that specific number, 12, across two unrelated legal systems separated by 1,000 years and an entirely different religious framework? Brundage's research points to a detail that reframes the number entirely. Canon law scholars themselves, writing in the 12th and 13th centuries, connected the age of 12 loosely to observed average ages of female puberty onset in their own population, treating the legal threshold as an attempt, however crude, by modern medical standards, to tie legal capacity to a biological marker rather than to an arbitrary round number. Whether that connection was medically accurate by the standards of the time is a separate question from whether it was the stated legal logic, and Brundage's research is clear that it was. In fact, the stated logic canon lawyers themselves gave. That stated logic is worth comparing directly against modern demographic data on puberty timing, since medieval European populations, subject to significantly harsher nutritional conditions than modern industrialized populations, would be expected, based on the well-documented modern relationship between childhood nutrition and pubertal timing, to have experienced average puberty onset considerably later than 12, a detail that further supports Evans, Grubbs's, and Brundage's shared conclusion that the number was functioning as a conservative outer legal floor, not as a description of when canon lawyers actually expected the average girl in their own population to reach physical maturity. Push forward again into English common law specifically, because this is the legal tradition that most directly shaped marriage law in Britain, and later colonial and early American jurisdictions. Legal historian Rebecca Probert of the University of Exeter, whose research on the history of English marriage law includes her extensively cited 2009 book, Marriage Law and Practice in the Long 18th Century, has documented that English common law inherited the same 12 and 14 threshold, directly from canon law, and that this figure remained on the statute books, essentially unchanged, from the medieval period all the way through to the Age of Marriage Act of 1929, which finally raised the minimum age to 16 for both sexes. Probert's research is specific about something worth naming as a pattern interrupt here. Despite the legal minimum sitting at 12 for roughly 7 centuries in English law, Probert's own analysis of English parish marriage registers from the 16th through 18th centuries found that the actual average age of first marriage for women during most of that period sat considerably higher, frequently in the mid to late 20s, one of the latest average marriage ages documented anywhere in pre-industrial Europe. Probert's research methodology, much like Laslet's Cambridge group work, relies on direct primary source reconstruction rather than legal or literary inference. English parish registers, required by law from the 16th century onward to record marriages, baptisms, and burials, allow historians to calculate actual marriage age directly by cross-referencing a bride's recorded baptism date against her recorded marriage date within the same parish record. Probert's analysis, covering tens of thousands of individual recorded marriages across multiple English counties and multiple centuries, found this mid to late 20s average holding with striking consistency across the period, directly contradicting a popular modern assumption, which Probert's published work explicitly addresses and corrects, that pre-modern English brides typically married in early or mid-adolescence simply because the legal minimum allowed it. Here's the disturbing part, and it's disturbing specifically because of what it implies about the relationship between law and lived practice. If the legal minimum sat at 12 for 700 years, but the actual average marriage age for most of that same period sat in the mid-20s, then the law was never functioning as a description of ordinary practice. It was functioning as an outer boundary, a technical floor almost nobody actually married at, except in specific identifiable circumstances that this video will return to directly. That pattern, a low legal floor sitting far below actual lived practice, turns out not to be unique to European Christian legal traditions at all, and tracing it into an entirely separate legal system strengthens the case considerably. Historian Judith Tucker, whose research on Islamic legal history includes her extensively cited work analyzing Ottoman-era Islamic court records from Egypt and Greater Syria, has documented that classical Islamic jurisprudence across the major legal schools generally did not set a single fixed numerical minimum age for marriage in the way Roman and canon law did, relying instead on a legal concept of physical and mental maturity referred to across Islamic legal sources as bulugh, that courts and jurists were expected to assess on a case-by-case basis rather than applying a uniform number. Tucker's direct analysis of surviving Ottoman court records, actual case files rather than theoretical legal texts, found that recorded marriage ages, particularly for the consummation and cohabitation stage rather than the contract stage, clustered considerably later than the theoretical minimum some jurists discussed, generally in the mid to late teens, with regional and class variation comparable to the variation Evans-Grubbs documented in the Roman evidence. Historian Judith Tucker's court record research is specific about a detail that maps almost exactly onto the canon law distinction already covered in this video. Ottoman-era Islamic marriage contracts frequently included an explicit, separately negotiated delay between the contract date and the consummation date, a legal mechanism functionally identical to canon law's distinction between marriage de présentee and actual cohabitation, arrived at independently through an entirely separate legal and theological tradition with no direct textual link to European canon law. That independent convergence, three unrelated legal systems, Roman, canon, and Islamic, arriving at broadly similar mechanisms for separating legal marriage from lived cohabitation, is itself a significant piece of evidence about what these societies across very different religious and cultural contexts actually understood themselves to be doing when they set a low numerical or conceptual floor. Push now toward the actual mechanism driving marriage timing in the overwhelming majority of documented pre-modern societies. Because legal minimums, it turns out, were rarely the real force setting the calendar. The real force was demographic. Demographic historian Massimo Livi-Bacci of the University of Florence, whose comparative research on pre-modern European population patterns is detailed extensively in his widely cited book, A Concise History of World Population, has documented mortality figures for pre-industrial populations that are difficult to fully absorb from a modern vantage point. Across most of documented pre-industrial Europe, Livi-Bacci's data shows infant and child mortality rates commonly reaching 20 to 30% of live births dying before age 5, with some populations and periods running measurably higher during famine or epidemic years. Maternal mortality, meanwhile, tracked by historical demographers, including work synthesized by Livi-Bacci and by economic historian Gregory Clark of the University of California. Davis, in his research on pre-industrial English demographic records, ran at rates that meant a meaningful share of women who survived to adulthood would not survive multiple childbirths across their reproductive lifespan. Livi-Bacci's broader demographic modeling adds a further layer worth naming directly, because it moves this from a matter of grim statistics into a matter of household-level strategic calculation. Given the mortality figures documented across pre-industrial populations, Livi-Bacci's research estimates that a pre-modern woman needed to give birth to somewhere in the range of 5 to 7 children, on average, simply to see roughly 2 survive to their own reproductive age, the minimum required for a population to avoid long-term decline. That figure alone reframes the pressure toward earlier marriage in stark terms. A household operating inside this demographic reality wasn't weighing early marriage against some comfortable low-risk alternative of waiting. It was weighing early marriage against a real calculable chance that delay itself could mean a lineage's effective end, given how narrow the margin between births and survivors to adulthood actually was. Now hold that mortality data against a household's actual calculation, because this is where marriage timing starts to make a very different kind of sense. A household deciding when to marry a daughter wasn't simply weighing tradition against convenience. It was weighing, whether explicitly calculated or absorbed through generations of accumulated practical wisdom, the very real chance that waiting carried its own risk. The risk that a daughter, or the household head arranging the match, or a prospective husband might not survive to see a delayed marriage occur at all. Livi-Bacci's broader demographic argument holds that pre-modern reproductive strategy across most documented populations functioned as a system calibrated against catastrophic, unpredictable mortality, not against the assumption of a long, predictable lifespan that underlies most modern family planning. But listen to what this demographic pressure actually produced when measured against real marriage age data, because the picture is more complicated than high mortality equals universally early marriage. Historian Peter Laslett, whose research through the Cambridge Group for the History of Population and Social Structure fundamentally reshaped understanding of pre-modern European household formation starting in the 1960s and 1970s, documented what's now called the Northwestern European marriage pattern, characterized by exactly the kind of late marriage age Probert's parish registered data confirmed for England. Brides commonly in their mid-20s, grooms often slightly older, and a comparatively high rate of people who never married at all. Laslett's research found this pattern specifically in northwestern Europe, England, the Low Countries, parts of Scandinavia, and contrasted sharply with what economic historians have documented in Eastern and Southern Europe and in many non-European agrarian societies, where marriage tended to occur earlier and more universally. Laslett's research team's methodology is worth naming directly because it demonstrates how solid this particular data point actually is, rather than relying on legal texts or literary sources, which risk describing an ideal rather than a lived reality. The Cambridge Group systematically reconstructed household composition and marriage timing from primary sources including parish registers, household listings, and census-like local surveys, allowing marriage age to be calculated directly from thousands of individual recorded cases rather than inferred from theoretical or legal material. That methodological grounding is part of why Laslett's Northwestern European marriage pattern finding has held up so consistently across subsequent decades of demographic history research, including Probert's later independently conducted parish register work, already cited in this video. That contrast matters because it demonstrates directly that high pre-modern mortality alone cannot fully explain early marriage age, since Northwestern Europe experienced broadly comparable mortality conditions to much of the rest of the continent while still producing a late marriage pattern. Something else, beyond mortality risk alone, was setting the actual calendar in different regions, and that something else turns out to be economic, specifically tied to how a household's land and labor were organized. Historian Alan McFarlane, whose comparative research on English marriage patterns connects directly to Laslett's demographic findings, has argued that the Northwestern European late marriage pattern was tied specifically to a system in which young people, both male and female, typically needed to accumulate their own independent economic resources, often through a period of paid service in another household, before marriage was considered viable at all. A new household under this system needed to be economically self-sufficient from its formation, which meant marriage had to wait until both parties had accumulated enough resources, land, savings, tools, to establish that independent household. This directly explains why English marriage age sat so much higher than the bare legal minimum canon law and common law had inherited from Rome. The legal floor was set by a religious and legal tradition tracking biological capacity, but the actual practice was set by an entirely separate economic system tracking household formation capacity. And in Northwestern Europe, those two thresholds simply didn't align. So what happened in regions where household formation didn't require this kind of independent economic accumulation first? This is where dowry and bride price systems enter the picture directly, and where the real economic engine behind earlier marriage in many other regions becomes visible. Anthropologist Jack Goody, whose comparative research across dozens of societies, published extensively including his influential 1976 book Production and Reproduction, mapped the global distribution of dowry systems, where a bride's family transfers property to the new couple or to the husband's family, against bride price systems, where a groom's family transfers property to the bride's family, found that these two systems correlated tightly with different agricultural and economic structures. Dowry systems, Goody's research found, clustered heavily in intensive agricultural societies across Eurasia, including much of India, China, and Europe, where land was a scarce, heavily competed for resource, and where a dowry functioned essentially as a daughter's portion of family inheritance, transferred at marriage rather than at a parent's death. Goody's comparative framework draws a specific contrast worth naming directly because it sharpens exactly why dowry systems, rather than bride price systems, produced the strongest documented pressure toward earlier female marriage age. In bride price societies, Goody's research found clustered more heavily in sub-Saharan Africa and other regions with extensive rather than intensive agriculture and comparatively lower land scarcity. The direction of payment reversed the underlying financial incentive. A groom's family paid the bride's family, meaning a daughter functioned, in blunt economic terms, as a source of incoming wealth for her birth family rather than an outgoing cost. And Goody's data found bride price systems correlated with comparatively less pressure toward very early marriage age, since delaying a daughter's marriage carried less direct household financial cost, and in some documented cases even increased her bride price value as she reached fuller physical maturity. That reversal is worth sitting with for a moment, because it demonstrates directly that the economic logic driving marriage timing, rather than any fixed cultural attitude toward daughters generally, was doing most of the real work. The same underlying question, a family's calculation about the financial cost or benefit of delaying a daughter's marriage, produced opposite pressure on the calendar, depending entirely on which direction money moved at the wedding itself. A detail that Goody's comparative cross-cultural data makes difficult to explain through any single cultural or religious motive operating independently of the underlying property system. Consider what that mechanism actually implies about marriage timing, because it directly explains why daughters, specifically, faced pressure toward earlier marriage in dowry-based societies in a way sons often didn't. Under a dowry system, as Goody's research documents, a daughter's marriage functioned as the primary and often only mechanism by which she received her share of family property, since land itself typically passed down the male line. That made the timing of a daughter's marriage a direct financial event for the household, tied to whenever the family could assemble the dowry itself. And historians of South Asian marriage practice, including work by demographic historian Tim Dyson, synthesizing regional data across multiple centuries, have documented that dowry inflation, competitive pressure, driving dowry amounts upward over successive generations, created direct financial incentive for families to marry daughters earlier, since dowry expectations for younger brides were often documented as comparatively lower than for brides who had passed a certain age, compounding the pressure toward early marriage specifically for economic reasons entirely separate from mortality risk or legal minimums. Now here's the disturbing part, because it inverts a common modern assumption about which family a child marriage most directly served. The popular image often centers on a husband's family gaining something through a young bride. Goody's comparative data complicates that picture considerably. In dowry-paying societies specifically, it was frequently the bride's own family absorbing the direct financial cost of marriage, sometimes catastrophic financial cost, documented in multiple regional studies as a leading cause of household debt. Meaning the pressure toward earlier marriage in these systems often originated as much from a birth family's economic calculation, managing debt, timing a payment before it grew larger, freeing a household of a dependent whose dowry cost would only increase with time, as from anything resembling a groom's family exercising direct control. Push now into the specific legal mechanism that made a daughter's marriage timing more urgent, in a formal legal sense, than a son's in an enormous number of documented patrilineal societies, because this connects the economic pressure already described directly to questions of lineage and inheritance law. Anthropologist and legal historian Jack Goody's broader body of research, alongside comparative work by historian David Hurley, whose research on medieval family and inheritance patterns was published extensively, including his influential 1985 book Medieval Households, documented that patrilineal inheritance systems, in which property and lineage passed through the male line, created a specific and often legally codified anxiety around paternity certainty that had no direct male equivalent. A son's paternity within these legal systems was rarely in practical dispute in the same way. A daughter's future children, however, and specifically whether those children could be reliably identified as belonging to a specific patriline, depended entirely on controlling the timing and circumstances of her sexual and reproductive life. And marriage functioned within these legal frameworks as the primary mechanism for establishing that control in a way the law itself would recognize and enforce. Hurley's research on medieval European inheritance disputes specifically documents extensive legal machinery built around exactly this concern: legitimacy challenges, paternity disputes tied to inheritance claims, and formal legal doctrine establishing presumptions of legitimacy tied directly to the timing and documentation of marriage. Hurley's archival work, drawing heavily on Florentine tax and household census records from the 15th century known as the catasto, found that this anxiety expressed itself in measurable demographic terms. Recorded age gaps between husbands and wives in these Florentine records were often substantial, with husbands frequently a decade or more older than wives at first marriage. A pattern Hurley connects directly to a household strategy of marrying daughters early, specifically to minimize the window of unmarried adulthood during which questions of paternity control might arise, while men delayed marriage until they had accumulated sufficient wealth and standing to support a household. A pattern that echoes through an entirely separate mechanism, the same male delay, female early pattern, already discussed in the context of Northwestern European household formation economics. Comparative anthropological research across other patrilineal systems, including work synthesized in Goody's cross-cultural analysis, finds the same underlying legal logic recurring across unrelated legal traditions on multiple continents. Earlier marriage for daughters reduced the window of ambiguity around future paternity, which mattered enormously in any legal system where inheritance, land rights, and lineage-based social status flowed exclusively or primarily through confirmed paternal descent. That's the pattern worth sitting with directly, because it reframes something that might otherwise look like a single, simple explanation into something considerably more structural. This wasn't primarily, according to this body of research, a matter of controlling a daughter's body for its own sake, or purely a matter of managing mortality risk, or purely a matter of financial transaction through dowry. It was a specific documented legal response to the mechanics of patrilineal inheritance itself, a system in which land, title, and lineage passed through fathers, required, as a matter of legal and economic necessity within that system's own internal logic, a reliable mechanism for establishing paternity beyond reasonable doubt, and marriage, timed as early as the surrounding legal and demographic framework allowed, functioned as that mechanism. Push into one more economic layer before turning to this video's real turn, because agrarian household labor economics adds a final distinct pressure that operated alongside, and sometimes independently of, the inheritance and dowry pressures already described. Economic historian Jane Humphreys of the University of Oxford, whose research on household economics in pre-industrial and early industrial England has been published extensively, including her 2010 book, Childhood and Child Labor in the British Industrial Households, functioned fundamentally as economic production units, not simply as domestic or emotional arrangements. Every additional working member, including a new spouse, represented a direct addition to household labor capacity, meaningful for a family engaged in subsistence or near subsistence agriculture, where labor shortage could mean the direct difference between a surviving harvest and a failed one. Humphreys' research specifically documents that in labor-scarce agrarian contexts, marriage timing correlated directly with a household's assessment of its own labor needs relative to available working-age members, a calculation entirely separate from either canon law's legal minimum or a family's dowry timing strategy, though frequently operating alongside both simultaneously. Humphreys' broader research on household economic strategy documents a further wrinkle worth naming directly. Labor-driven marriage timing pressure operated differently depending on a household's specific position within the agrarian economy. Households with insufficient land or labor of their own often used marriage, and the labor a new spouse brought with them, as a direct strategy for household survival during periods of labor scarcity, while wealthier landholding households, with more labor capacity already available, faced comparatively less urgent labor-driven pressure, and could, according to Humphreys' data, more easily afford the kind of delayed marriage the Northwestern European independent household formation pattern required. That distinction adds a class dimension to marriage timing pressure that recurs across nearly every mechanism this video has traced so far. Poorer households, facing the tightest labor margins, the least capacity to absorb dowry cost over time, and the least ability to wait out mortality risk, consistently show up across multiple independent bodies of research as facing the strongest documented pressure toward earlier marriage, while wealthier households in the same societies frequently married measurably later. This creates a genuinely layered picture. Once all four mechanisms, legal minimum, mortality pressure, dowry and inheritance economics, and household labor need, are placed side by side, none of them, on its own, fully explains the historical pattern of early marriage across the range of societies this video has surveyed. Each one contributed real, documented pressure operating through entirely different institutional channels: law, demography, property transfer, and labor economics. And the actual marriage age observed in any specific historical population depended on which combination of these pressures dominated in that particular time and place. England's unusually late marriage age emerged specifically because its household formation economic system requiring independent economic accumulation before marriage outweighed the pull of the legal minimum and whatever mortality pressure existed. Dowry-heavy agrarian societies elsewhere often saw the opposite balance, where inheritance and dowry timing pressure pushed marriage age down toward, or in some documented cases uncomfortably close to, the legal minimum itself. And this is where the real turn in the story takes shape. Because underneath all four of these documented mechanisms sits a detail this video has already flagged twice without fully addressing. Nearly every one of these legal systems, independently, built in a recognized distinction between the legal minimum age of marriage and the age at which a marriage was expected to actually be consummated and cohabited. Return to Brundage's research on canon law specifically, because this is where that distinction was most explicitly formally legislated. Canon law, as Brundage's research documents in detail, recognized two separate categories of marriage contract: marriage de presenti, an exchange of present tense consent that created a legally binding marriage immediately, and marriage de futuro, a promise to marry at a future date, which functioned closer to a formal engagement than a completed marriage. Critically, Brundage's research documents that church courts across medieval Europe repeatedly addressed cases involving marriages contracted at or near the legal minimum age, where consummation and cohabitation were explicitly delayed, sometimes by several years until the bride reached what canon lawyers themselves, in surviving court records Brundage cites directly, described as sufficient physical maturity, a standard distinct from and generally set higher than the bare legal minimum of 12. Historian Frederick Pedersen, whose research on medieval English church court records, published in his study of the York Cause Papers, documents actual litigated cases from medieval English ecclesiastical courts, found repeated instances of exactly this pattern in practice. Marriage contracts formed at or near the legal minimum age, explicitly structured around a delayed cohabitation date, with church courts treating premature consummation, forced cohabitation before the bride was judged sufficiently mature, as a recognized legal grievance that could, in some documented cases, be brought before ecclesiastical authorities. Pedersen's archival work on the York Cause Papers is specific about the kind of evidence involved in these cases. Since ecclesiastical courts operating in medieval England kept detailed written records of testimony, witness statements, and formal rulings, a documentary trail that lets historians reconstruct not just the legal principle, but its actual contested application. Pedersen's research describes cases in which family members, and in some instances the young brides themselves, brought testimony before church courts, specifically disputing whether a marriage should proceed to cohabitation, with courts weighing physical development, stated readiness, and family circumstances part of their ruling rather than applying the bare numerical minimum automatically. That detail matters because it demonstrates the legal gap between contract and cohabitation wasn't simply a passive social norm loosely observed. It was, in a documented number of cases, Pedersen's archival research recovers directly an actively litigated legal question, with real courts issuing real rulings specifically to prevent premature cohabitation from proceeding. That's the causal reversal worth sitting with, and it's worth naming directly, because it complicates a natural assumption a modern viewer might otherwise carry away from everything covered so far in this video. The assumption might run, since legal marriage age sat so low, and marriage functioned as this dense web of economic, demographic, and legal machinery, the historical record shows societies broadly comfortable with very young girls entering full marital cohabitation as a matter of routine practice. Brundage's and Pedersen's research on canon law's own internal distinctions complicates that assumption directly. The legal minimum age of marriage contract and the socially expected age of actual cohabitation were, across a substantial portion of the documented medieval European legal record, deliberately different numbers, separated by a gap that the legal system itself recognized, named, and in some jurisdictions actively enforced through court intervention when that gap was violated. This reframes everything covered earlier in this video. The number 12, appearing across Roman law, canon law, and English common law, was never functioning within these systems' own internal logic. As a target age for cohabitation, it was functioning as a legal floor for contract validity, a technical threshold beneath which a marriage simply could not exist as a binding legal instrument, layered underneath a separate, less formally codified but still widely documented social expectation that actual married life in the full modern sense of shared household and sexual relationship would begin considerably later, once physical maturity, and in Northwestern Europe's case, independent economic capacity, had actually been reached. Once that reframing sets in, the earlier data points read differently too. Evans Grubbs' Roman funerary and contract evidence, showing later actual cohabitation despite a legal minimum of 12, Probert's English parish registers showing average marriage ages in the mid-20s despite a legal minimum unchanged since the medieval period. Pedersen's church court cases treating premature cohabitation as an actionable grievance, all of these converge on the same underlying structural fact. The legal number and the lived practice were, across a meaningful share of the documented historical record, two different things by design, not by accident. And conflating the two flattens a genuinely more complicated and, in a specific sense, more legally cautious historical reality than the number 12 alone suggests. Which raises the obvious harder question sitting underneath the back half of this video. If the systems themselves recognized this gap and built legal machinery to manage it, where did that machinery fail, and what did failure actually look like in the documented historical record? The honest answer, drawn from the same body of research already cited, is that the gap between legal minimum and expected cohabitation age collapsed most reliably under conditions of acute poverty, war, and specific legal or political regimes that deliberately lowered or ignored the protective threshold canon law and comparable systems had built in. Humphreys' research on household economics documents that in periods of severe economic crisis, famine years, war-driven labor shortages, catastrophic dowry debt, the buffer between legal minimum and social expectation narrowed measurably because the economic pressures already described in this video, labor need, dowry timing, inheritance urgency, intensified precisely when a household's margin for waiting evaporated. Demographic historian Liddy Bacci's broader research on crisis mortality periods documents comparable patterns. Societies under acute demographic stress following major epidemics or famines showed measurable shifts toward earlier actual marriage and cohabitation age, not merely earlier legal contract. Precisely because the mortality risk calculation described earlier in this video intensified sharply during those specific crisis windows. Pedersen's own York Cause Papers research adds a specific documented illustration of exactly this collapse in practice, worth naming directly because it demonstrates the mechanism isn't purely theoretical. A meaningful share of the disputed cohabitation cases Pedersen's archival work recovers involve family circumstances explicitly tied to financial hardship, a father's death, a household's sudden loss of income, or pressure from a groom's family to proceed with cohabitation ahead of the socially expected timeline. Precisely the kind of acute economic pressure Humphreys's broader research identifies as the consistent trigger for gap collapse. In cases where the church court sided with delaying cohabitation despite this pressure, the ruling functioned as the protective mechanism holding as designed. In cases where courts either weren't petitioned in time or ruled otherwise, Pedersen's research suggests the underlying economic pressure typically won out over the socially expected maturity standard. Legal historians have also documented specific regimes and legal codes that deliberately abandoned the protective gap other systems had maintained. Research on colonial-era legal codes across multiple regions, including comparative work synthesized by legal historians studying the imposition of European common law onto colonized populations, has documented cases where colonial administrations either lowered existing local marriage age protections or failed to recognize and enforce customary protective mechanisms, including cohabitation delay customs, that pre-colonial legal systems in the affected regions had themselves developed and maintained. This is a genuinely important detail for a complete picture. The erosion of the legal minimum versus cohabitation gap wasn't purely an ancient or medieval phenomenon that modern society simply corrected over time. In numerous documented cases, it was actively worsened by specific historical interventions, including colonial legal imposition, that overrode existing, more protective local legal machinery. Push toward the present day briefly, because this history connects directly and traceably to where current law and current global data sit. According to UNICEF's most recent comprehensive global data compilation on child marriage, published through its ongoing monitoring of the practice worldwide, an estimated 1 in 5 young women globally were married before the age of 18. As of the organization's most recent reporting period, with the practice concentrated most heavily in specific regions of South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, and UNICEF's research specifically identifies poverty, humanitarian crisis, and displacement, and gaps in legal enforcement, not primarily cultural or religious tradition in isolation, as the strongest predictive factors for continued child marriage in the modern data, a finding that lines up with strikingly precise consistency against the historical mechanisms this entire video has just traced. Mortality, adjacent crisis pressure, economic desperation, and breakdowns in legal protective machinery. Not simply the persistence of an old legal number on a distant statute book, UNICEF's monitoring data adds one further data point that maps almost exactly onto the historical pattern this video has traced across Roman, canon, Islamic, and English legal history. Documented rates of child marriage rise measurably in regions experiencing active humanitarian crisis, armed conflict, or forced displacement compared against otherwise similar regions not experiencing acute crisis. A pattern UNICEF's own published analysis attributes directly to families facing exactly the kind of acute economic and safety pressure that this video's earlier chapters identified as the historical trigger for gap collapse. Households facing sudden loss of income, physical insecurity, or the breakdown of ordinary legal and social protective structures reaching for marriage as an immediate, if often harmful, strategy under conditions that most closely resemble the crisis conditions Livybachi's demographic research and Pedersen's court records both independently identified centuries earlier as the specific circumstances under which the historical protective gap most reliably failed. That alignment between historical mechanism and current data is worth sitting with directly because it suggests something the earlier sections of this video have been building toward all along. Child marriage was never, across the full span of documented history, a single monolithic practice sustained by a single motive. It was, and according to UNICEF's current data continues to be, a symptom that flares specifically under conditions of poverty, crisis, and legal protection failure. Layered onto legal and economic systems, dowry and bride price economics, patrilineal inheritance anxiety, agrarian labor need, that created underlying pressure even in more stable periods, but that pressure most reliably crossed into the kind of premature cohabitation canon law's own courts once treated as a punishable grievance, specifically when a household's protective margin, financial, legal, or demographic, collapsed entirely. Now, zoom out across everything this video has traced. A legal minimum of 12 inherited across Roman, canon, and English common law for the better part of 2,000 years that functioned as a contractual floor rather than a lived target. And that an entirely separate legal tradition, classical Islamic jurisprudence, arrived at through comparable mechanisms despite no direct textual connection to Roman or canon law. A demographic reality of catastrophic pre-modern mortality that pressured but did not on its own determine actual marriage timing, since Northwestern Europe's late marriage pattern emerged under broadly similar mortality conditions to regions that married considerably earlier. a set of dowry and bride price systems that turned a daughter's marriage into a specific timed financial transaction, often at real cost to her own birth family. And that produced measurably different pressure depending on which direction the payment flowed. A patrilineal inheritance system that required marriage as a legal mechanism for establishing paternity certainty, documented directly in Florentine tax records showing consistent age gaps between spouses. A household labor economy that treated a new spouse as a direct addition to productive capacity, with the sharpest pressure falling specifically on the poorest households with the least labor margin to spare. And underneath all four of those pressures, a widely documented, formally recognized legal gap between contract and cohabitation that these same historical systems built, maintained, and in specific court cases actively enforced. A gap that held under ordinary conditions and collapsed specifically under poverty crisis. And legal breakdown in a pattern the current global data on child marriage continues to reproduce with uncomfortable precision. None of these five mechanisms, legal floor, mortality pressure, dowry and inheritance economics, paternity anxiety, and household labor need, operated in isolation, and no single one of them fully explains the pattern on its own. What the historical record actually shows, once all five are traced together and cross-referenced against real court cases, parish registers, funerary inscriptions, and tax records rather than assumption alone, is a system considerably more layered, more internally self-aware, and in specific documented instances, more actively protective of exactly the gap between legal minimum and lived practice than a single flat statistic like the number 12 could ever convey on its own. Somewhere in a surviving fragment of a medieval English church court record, filed away in an archive most people will never see, there is very likely a case exactly like the ones Pedersen documented. A marriage contracted at the legal minimum, a cohabitation date deliberately delayed, and a court willing to intervene the moment someone tried to collapse that gap early. A small, largely forgotten piece of legal machinery built by a society that, whatever else it got wrong, understood the difference between a number written into a law and a life actually being lived, and built its rules, however imperfectly, around trying to keep the two apart.